Find it on that one. Okie doke. Can you hear me now if I do it on here? Woohoo! Right, I'm turning that off on my computer so we don't get background. Let me just go into the top. Sorry for the face pulling. That was stressful. Okay, so I think we can pretty much go. Yep. Can you see that? Yay, it's working. Exciting. Oh, we've got more now. Happy days. I don't know what's going on with that computer. I've done two today, so 2 out of 3 isn't too bad. I'll give it a couple of minutes and then I'll get started. Hello? You should hear me now, Catherine. We're just waiting for a couple of minutes and then I'll get started. Can you hear now, Catherine? Perfect. Megan, are you happy for me to start now? I've kept everybody waiting. Hi, Marie. Oh, that's good. Okay, right. Huge apologies about that. I don't know what's going on with my computer, but it just wouldn't connect properly at all. And it told me I had sound, but I really didn't. So I'll do a very brief introduction, to explain who I am, and then we'll get started. So my name's Mel Glazard, and I am a consultant in education in the UK. So I work all over the UK as a school improvement advisor, and I also write a lot of leadership development training, which I deliver across the region as well. One of my biggest roles is that I'm actually a consultant for something called the National English Hub, and I write a lot of material for our region's English Hub. So some of this work has come from that research, which I thought would be really helpful to share with all of you today. It's called the 7-step model for vocabulary instruction. And all of my work is about bringing new vocabulary to life for either young children or people who have English as a learning language. So I'm hoping that by the end of today, you'll all have some tangible techniques that you can take away with you and use regardless of what setting that you're currently working in. So if I just share the session aims, we're going to look at the rationale behind explicit vocabulary instruction so that it is actually taught discreetly. I'm going to introduce you to a flowchart for teaching. The seminar will be about an hour. I'll be as quick as I can because we are quite late. I'm going to introduce you to a flowchart for teaching and how to use that in your own setting, which you're welcome to take away. Looking at briefly how we can incorporate our learning environment, and that includes with limited resourcing as well. Thinking about continued learning outside of the classroom and then consolidation, and then also a little bit of reflection time for yourselves towards the end as well. Okay, so let me just... There is quite a rationale behind explicit instruction. So my vision is really poor on this phone. And all of this work I've actually taken from some research that I did with the Education Endowment Foundation. Now, we're going to really look at the approaches that are needed to emphasise spoken language and verbal interaction and how we can support the development of that communication and language for learners. We're going to think about how the quality of approaches is actually far more important than the quantity of those approaches. High impact for those disadvantaged learners. Studies have already shown that actually we have a larger impact and effect for children that are actually from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that's for a couple of reasons really. It is a high priority, but particularly when students enter any education setting from a disadvantaged background, they're more likely to have a less extensive vocabulary. So it's really quite important that we aid their development. It's also been shown that actually if you have that explicit instruction, it has impact on the children or the learners' self-regulation, socio-emotional development, and also their reasoning skills, which that will become more clear as we go through. Now, obviously, vocabulary instruction is just one strand. We need a much broader approach to improving communication, language, and literacy, which you'll see as we go. Okay, so the Education Endowment Foundation, they're research-led. They actually carry out research projects into a number of interventions at the moment across the UK. But what they found is that actually this particular instruction has had a huge impact, and they've measured it across hundreds of schools in the UK. But also when we're thinking about that language development, so if on entry into the early years, young children have only got minimal language, which predominantly they have, and multiple different languages in one setting, that we must also consider, providing learners with a rich language environment, that the words that we teach them, we have to carefully select. Okay, they're not just ad hoc, which I'll model to you shortly. Developing the number of words that we expose them to throughout the year, and then also building on their understanding of the relationships between those words. So throughout our settings, we need to ensure that we provide them with multiple opportunities to hear and to use the new vocabulary that we've exposed them to. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you now to something called the 3-tier framework. This has been taken from Isabella Beck's Bringing Words to Life. It's a fabulous text. If you get a chance to have a look at it, I highly recommend. Now, the 3-tier framework, obviously it's in 3 parts. It breaks down vocabulary for learners. So if we look at that first tier at the bottom, that consists predominantly of basic words that we would expect to be drawing on when we communicate with others. So things like dog and tired, run, swim, look, and so on. Now, these words would typically appear in oral conversation, okay? So children are exposed to them at a very high frequency from a very early age. Now, this exposure will mean that children become familiar with this set of words pretty readily, to be honest. And so these tier 1 words, as we call them, they don't generally require instructional attention, particularly with attention to their meanings when you're in school. Now, if we jump then to the 3rd tier at the very top, this would be subject-specific language, which obviously learners are going to come across less frequently. In general, these words, they wouldn't be utilised very highly by the learner. So they're best learned when the subject-specific need arises. We wouldn't necessarily follow this 7-step model for those tier 3 words or for the tier 1. Now, the 2nd tier that we're going to be focusing on today, they are high-frequency words, and they can be found in various disciplines, okay, and across a variety of domains ordinarily. These would be words like contradict or proceed or circumstances, retrospect. Now, they're very characteristic of what we would call written texts, but they're not found as frequently, especially in conversation, which means that the students are less likely to learn these words kind of independently compared to the tier 1 words that they might hear in everyday language. Now, because of the role of these tier 2 words, that's why it's so important that we expose the learner to them as often as we can, and that's where the explicit instruction comes to play. Okay, so this is what I call a Mel Glazard flowchart of teaching. I do apologise. This I do have a document for as well, which I will get to Megan so that it can be emailed out to everybody. This flowchart for teaching that I've shown you on the screen now from left to right, these are the 7 steps that we would follow for vocabulary instruction. Okay, I'll just talk you through them briefly, and then I am going to break them down as well as to how you actually use them. You would follow this without fail, so at no point would we cut out any of the 7 strands of that teaching, because it's important that the learner gets the repetition, they become familiar with the style in which we use when we're learning new vocabulary. So in the first instance is just to read and identify words that potentially the learners are not familiar with. So it may be that you've got a section of text that you come across, and within that section of text, there are a number of words that confuse the learner, and that then gives you the cue as to where your teaching is coming from. In the second instance, very straightforward, regardless of the age of the learner, we would then verbalise those words. So it'd be almost like a repeat after me, my turn and your turn. I say it, you say it, just using those simple gestures. Repeat the word, say the word, repeat the word, and then ask the learner to do the same. What we would then look to do is to actually contextualise that new vocabulary, okay, so that you're talking around those target words that they've come across that have stumbled them, and you would contextualise them for their understanding, which I'll give you some further examples of a little bit down the line. Then we would look for explanation, and I'm going to talk about why we avoid dictionary definition a little bit down the line as well. So we would create a learner-friendly explanation for each of the new words that we've come across. The 5th stage would be finding examples of those words, but potentially used in different contexts. The 6th stage is where we engage in the learning activity to embed the true meaning of that vocabulary. We can never assume that they understand until we've gone through that process. And then the 7th and final stage is just making assessments and observations so we know further learning needs or what we need to do next. So what I'd like you to do, I've put a text onto the screen here, and it's called How Do We Know Which Words to Teach? Now this section of text is it is a real text, I haven't made it up. I'd like you just to have a little read through and identify which words could potentially be tier 2 words. Just so have a little read. It may be all of them, but hopefully not. If in doubt, when identifying which ones are tier 2, think about what I said before with those words that they're more likely to use in everyday life. So, for example, treated might be one. Okay, so I'm just going to click onto the next slide, and it will show you the words that I'd identified as tier 2 vocabulary, the words that we want to teach the learner. So we had treated, merchant, required, absence, tend, maintain, performed, fortunate, and benevolent, sorry, tongue twister. Okay, so we've identified the words that we're going to teach. And that is where we would then verbalize them and contextualize them. So you would just say the word in the first instance, but then you would contextualize, which would be like so. So the original stated that Johnny Harrington was a kind master who treated his servants fairly. Now, if I think of some of the learners that I've worked with quite recently, they're not really familiar with like master and servant. So we would then change it so that it's in a context that they're a little bit more familiar with. So read the original and verbalise in an accessible manner. I was treated fairly when I went to the doctors. So what I'd like you to do now is to just think of your own. So still using the word treated, can you come up with an alternative sentence that you might use with learners in your setting so that they understand clearly, or a little more clearly, what it might mean? So that is steps 1 and 2 on our flow chart. Once we've done that, we would then provide an explanation. Okay. Now, the problem we have with dictionaries is that actually they often give a really vague definition, which can be misinterpreted by the learner. The definitions often provide little information. And as an example, so a learner might manage to ask particular words about it, but it could be really misinterpreted. So if I give an example, I did one recently with some children. When they looked up conflict in the dictionary, it described it as a confrontation or an argument between two parties. They then got confused because they saw parties as something that you would attend rather than two parties or two groups of people. And then we often found that they'd be misusing that word in the wrong context. So they might say, Charlie and I were in conflict, where actually they'd only crossed a couple of words, not true conflict as we would see it. So instead of a dictionary definition, we would look that up, but we would put it into a kind of learner-friendly or child-friendly explanation. And we've really got to try and capture the true essence of what that word means. What I'd like you to, thinking about the word treated, can you give it a learner-friendly explanation? I'll go back a couple as well. Let's go back to those words. So if you were to look at the word required, for example, what explanation could you give that for the learner? If you were looking at the word tend, what explanation could you give to the learner? An example might be to look after or to work on. Have a look at those list of words there in yellow and see if you can come up with your own explanations that you might use in your context. I'm going to read a little section for you from my texts, which is, I will send you the link as well. It's called Bringing Words to Life by Isabella Beck. And she talks about truly capturing a word. So I'm just going to read a really small section out to you. It says the following: when introducing words to students, it's important to try to capture what a particular word is actually about, or something in particular about that actual word. What is its role in the language and what is communicated when we use that word? For example, if we think about the word controversy, a dictionary would define this as a discussion marked by opposing views or simply a disagreement. While these are both true, neither definition captures the contentious nature of controversy. Students might differ in their opinions of which video games are best, but that wouldn't be called a controversy. Consider what kinds of things are described as controversies. Not only is there the students' disagreement, but there is strong opposition on each side. An explanation of the word that might come closer to capturing to the heart of what it should actually be might be the following. Controversy is a strong disagreement about something that often involves a lot of discussion and angry feelings. So as you can see there, she's added a little bit more to that learner-friendly explanation. So we've verbalized, we've contextualized just very, very briefly and verbally, and then we've looked at finding a worthwhile explanation. Now, one element of practice that I've used in a number of settings is that when we've come across that new word, we just kind of plaster it on the wall, a bit like a working dictionary, really. And as we're going through these 7 stages, we add each one onto the wall until it's become truly embedded. So when we find those explanations, we would add them onto our working wall as such. Nothing fancy, just kind of scribbled on. Once we've looked at verbalizing, contextualizing, and finding a child-friendly or a learner-friendly explanation, we would then look for examples being used in different contexts. So this is where the preparation stages come in. And then we would also be looking to engage the learners in a series of activities to really embed the true meanings of each of those words that have been identified. So I'm going to break down for you the different activities that you might want to consider. They're very straightforward. They don't really require any resourcing. But once you've got those little tricks up your sleeve, they really do come in handy. So I'll break them down. Okay, what we want to think about is how we engage those learners. We're going to, any practice that we actually do has got to reinforce ways that the learner is made to think about the words and using the correct words when they're needed. Throughout this next process that I'll talk you through, it's making sure that as learners, they can make a connection to the word that's in front of them. Now, ideally, regardless of age, I would expect around 10 to 15 minutes just purely on new vocabulary, and you might do that over a period of 2 to 3 days. In some instances, I've seen it done over 5 days, so it just depends on how often they attend the setting. So I'm just going to share some of these with you. Okay, so the first activity that we would do to embed meaning is that we would look at, that's it, yeah, let me go back. Review the meaning with a question. For example, we're going to focus for the next few slides on the same couple of words, so it will be delicate or stumble. I've used them for all of them, to be honest. So the questions to the learner might be something like, does delicate mean something small and easily broken, or something big and heavy? Who would probably stumble more, a man who had difficulty seeing the road, or a child that is walking slowly home? Does morsel mean a big meal or a small piece of food? The idea with these questions really is that we're asking the children to rationalise their answers as well. But again, it's checking that they truly understand the meaning of that word. So we have the first one was review meanings with questions. Our next activity would be giving situations and examples, again, verbally. So for example, sometimes when you wear new boots, you tend to stumble because you're not used to walking in them. What are some other things that make people stumble? And again here, once you've done that verbal, that would be encouraging the conversation between learners before re-engaging back as a whole group. So we've got reviewing meanings with questions and situations and examples. The next activity that you might want to consider is just finding the missing word, very simple. So we tell them that we're going to say a sentence aloud that is missing one of the new words that we've been focusing on for the last couple of days. Can they identify the appropriate word to fill that gap? So I'd probably do this within a couple of days rather than on that first day. If you were walking to the edge of a mountain, you would not want to, and then they just select the appropriate word to fill that gap. Endless opportunities with that one. Then we play word association. So the teacher gives the learner a new word and they must say which word it makes them think of. For example, what word does trip make you think of? Okay. We will go back, don't worry. The next engage activity for section 6 is just to finish the sentence. Again, almost forcing the learner to rationalise and explain their thinking behind the meaning of the word. So the puppy stumbled on the path because. If they can explain, it might indicate whether they truly understand the meaning of that new vocabulary. The next one, just a simple yes, no. So share sentences that make sense and sentences that really do not. They tend to like this one a lot more actually, especially if they don't make sense because it evokes quite a lot of laughter. And then also, again, getting them to explain their answers. Making sure obviously throughout that the learners are able to give the appropriate response. So you would share the statement, the trunk of a tree is delicate. And then they've got to argue as to whether or not it would be seen as delicate, drawing on their understanding and being able to define, explain the meaning of the word. And then the next one, many flowers are small and delicate. So they might just give a yes, no, but even better if they can explain why they came up with that answer. And then we do with the children, what we call a final review. So what is the word that means small and easily broken? What is the word that means to trip and fall? So this final review we would do towards the end of that learning cycle for the new vocabulary for that week. And then obviously, once we've engaged in those activities, we get to the assess point for the learners. Just take a little read of those questions. I think the key thing, as I've put there, repetition is key, but it really is if we can keep repeating the same teaching cycle, as humans, we're wired to thrive on that repetition and to succeed. And we're allowing that each time we repeat that learning cycle. So what I'm going to do now, if we go back so many slides, because the theory sounds great, but once we start practicing and putting them together, it can be a different story. So if we go back to that original extract that I shared with you, she says, I'd like you to just choose one of those words from the list. And then once you've chosen that one word, we're going to go through each of those activities so you can have a little scribble and have a go at the embedding part. So we've got our word. We've done the verbalise and contextualise, which are the first two sections on our cycle. Now I'd like you to put that, first of all, into an explanation, almost like a learner-friendly definition. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that definition. And once you've created that definition that you could use with the learner, we're going to go on to the engage stage. So can you generate a couple of questions to review the meaning of the word that you chose? I tend to do a couple of reviewing meaning questions for each word. Obviously, some of the text levels are not going to be to that level that I've used as an example. Okay. So now I would like you to create your own situation and example. So, for example, if you chose, I don't know, fortunate, it might be Rosie felt fortunate when her grandma bought her a bag of sweets. When else might somebody feel fortunate? So they're coming up with different situations. Okay. Now I would like you to come up with a missing word sentence for your word. And now I'd like you to come up with something for word association. So you give them a word, what does it make you think of? So which words would you give them so that they think of the new word that you've identified? Once you've done word association, then you would go on to finish the sentence. Excuse me. So can you come up with a couple of finish the sentence examples for the word that you chose from our paragraph? The subordination because always works a charm really if we want them to be able to explain or rationalise. And then I'd like you to come up with some yes, no share sentences for the word that you identified, your tier 2 word. The joy of this one is that you can create some that make sense and some that really don't. I tend to find that silly examples engage them further. I'll keep looking. And now I'd like you to come up with some final review questions, a bit like the example above, but for the word that you chose from our paragraph. Again, it reinforces that talking around the new vocabulary. I think what I like about all of these activities that I've shared with you today, they don't really require a great deal of resources, and the main thing that it's doing is encouraging that dialogue between the teacher and the learner. It's all spoken, and the more we can do it, the stronger the technique will become. So then once we've done that final review, as I explained before, we go on to that assess stage of the pupil. If at any point when you are making the observations of those learners, you think, have they truly embedded it? And the answer is no, then it's really quite simple. You just go back and you repeat the entire cycle again. For older learners, it may be that you don't need to repeat all of the 7 stages, but you can just jump back into the flow and carry on. So I think don't go back over explaining it, just repeat the exact same cycle. Remodel what it is you want them to do. So I'm going to jump back, I do apologise, to the original flow chart, the original flow for teaching. She says. Aha, right. So we have, if I go back over those 7 stages, we have read, verbalise, contextualise, explain, find the explanation, example, engage, and assess. So as I said before, with some of those older learners, if you don't want to go right back to the beginning because it isn't needed, it might be that you go back to the contextualised stage of that cycle. But with any new vocabulary that's coming into their learning, the idea is that we do it for all of those words. Now, because a lot of it is done verbally, what we would then do to encourage that speaking and listening is think about how we can utilise the area that we're working in. I've done it in many. Here we go. So we think about, this is a much younger children's classroom, but the ideas are the same as on the images here. We don't really want it to be like what I would call a fancy display. Actually, we want it to be a wall dictionary. Now, the idea being that each week you can kind of rip some of that down, to be honest. So you would expect to have a blank wall. Or the words, once they're embedded, you've moved them along to somewhere else as a permanent kind of feature. The other thing I love about the examples that I'm showing you here, they are literally strips of paper. So it doesn't matter where that learning's taking place, but it truly is like a working wall, a working dictionary for the learner. So if I show you to the left-hand side, we've got some there with the senses, and they'd built up further vocabulary, and we just use post-it notes to stick on there. Once that had become embedded, we removed it, and then we'd got a blank canvas again, a bit like our DIY room, our tool area, to start again when we came across new text the following week and we were building their repertoire of language. The same again in the middle here. When we'd done some of that sentence work, that was actually modelled by the adult so that the learners could go back and reread those sentences. So we weren't engaging the learner in the written activity, because obviously that's going to come later. They've got to understand it and be able to read it before we can write it. So we just created their strips, like sentence strips that you could slice yourselves. We use different colours, they don't have to be. But when we were doing some of those examples, like the share sentences, we put the children's answers on in post-it notes as well. And then they would go back and reread some of those definitions and things. So over time, they're expanding their knowledge further. So what I'd like you to do now is just take a couple of minutes to think about how you could create your own kind of working wall or wall dictionary in your environment. Think about the resources that you've got access to. How would your learners benefit from a similar approach? It might be different, that's absolutely fine, but just take the time now to reflect for a couple of minutes as to how you might use something similar. It might be better, to be honest, that's quite an older one. But how could it help your learners in your setting? So just take a couple of minutes. The other joy as well with those, sorry, I keep talking, with the post-it notes there, the children were able to remove them off the wall because they were just like sticky notes. And then when they'd finished with them, they put them back because they did some talk time in partners and things as well. So say they'd got a new piece of vocabulary and they'd got some spare time during the day, the teacher actually set them the challenge of, right, go and pick one of the new words from the wall, and with your talking partner, I want you to create some of your own yes/no sentences verbally. So they went up, removed it off the wall, had a go together, and then once they'd finished it, they were able to just go and stick it back so that other learners could access it as well. So I'll give you a couple of minutes reflection time as to how you might be able to incorporate that into yours. And then finally, I have a couple of questions for you to consider for yourselves as well as practitioners. So in terms of some of the techniques that we've talked through, specifically for vocabulary instruction, are there any of these techniques that you could use in your own practice if you're not doing it already? Have you picked up any golden gems that you think, yep, I'm going to use that? Is it actually the entire 7-step model you think would be beneficial, trying to embed the learning of that new vocabulary? And if that is the case, what would you need to do after today so that you can use these techniques? Is there any preparation that's going to be needed? Is this something that you could disseminate to other practitioners that you work alongside? Could it be that actually you'd like to do some further reading on that subject area? Just jot down your own reflections. And that will be the end of our session. Now, I will be available now for a period of time to answer any questions that people might have. And I just ask you to complete the feedback form as well. I do apologise that we started later than planned. Technical issues today. But feel free to stay online and I'll answer any questions. Thank you.